Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cosmic Connection. This is your place to come and explore the order and the beauty of the cosmos and your connection to it all. My name is Amanda Walsh. I'm the founder of Astrology Hub and also the host of this show. I'm here with Rick Merlin Levine. And what do you think about the new countdown, Rick?
I like the new countdown.
Yeah, same here. And how was your birthday? His birthday was April 6th, everybody.
So this is what appeared at my front door, left by some masked delivery person.
Nice.
And it said something like "Happy birthday" from all of us at the Astrology Hub. And what a lovely thing! So thank you, Astrology Hub, for reminding me that I'm another year older and another year closer or farther or whatever. So yeah, it was a great birthday. It was absolutely quiet. I tried to stay off the computer almost all of the day, and I took a walk outside, and it was mellow, and I ate some good food, and better food than I could probably get at a restaurant, and that was it. And here we go. Another round.
You're another year that much more magical and amazing.
Aww.
So that is the truth. All right. So I'm glad that it was great. And there was lots of love. I don't know if you caught all the love from our community, but like people tagging you and wishing you happy birthday. And it was pretty beautiful.
Yes. All socially distanced.
Yeah. Very socially distanced.
Which is a statement of these times.
Absolutely, it is. And speaking of, so the topic that we're going to cover today is transhumanism and the Age of Aquarius. So I have a feeling this could be like 100 episodes, but I would love to start the conversation here today. And can we start with what is transhumanism? Because I don't know that everybody would know.
Yeah, well, for people who don't know what transhumanism is, all I can say is that it's a rabbit hole probably as large as any rabbit hole that one could ever imagine stumbling into. It's really something that began as a philosophical, I would say, pre-movement back 100 plus. Let me just think. About 150 years ago, when Nietzsche wrote "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," a very well-known piece of his, where Zarathustra was this archetype for this teacher who had gone off into the wilderness and come back and to teach what he had learned, and he was kind of like a modern-day prophet, if you will, Zarathustra, and in it, one of the things that he teaches is, I speak to you of the Overmensch. This is a German word, Overmensch, meaning overman. And it was actually these passages that many people attributed to the misinterpretation of all of this by the Nazi movement and the Aryan, the German tribe, or as being the overman, the lord, the superior race, if you will. And that's not what Nietzsche was talking about at all. He was talking about the idea that what we call humans are actually a bridge between what we were and what we will be. And what we will be is something that there's another word here, and I've yet to define transhumanism, and I will in a moment. And although many people might think this is a little outside of astrology, it's really not, because we're going to bring this back when we talk about Aquarius. But it just so happens that this is something that I've been very fascinated with and interested in, and have read a lot on over the last, I don't know, maybe 2 decades or so. But the other word we have to have in our mind is posthumanism, because transhumanism is where we are now, according to this philosophical movement, and posthumanism is where we are going. Now, we could say that this is another reflection of the Saturn square Uranus that we're experiencing this year, whereas Saturn is the species that we were, and something is the species that we are evolving to. We humans have this weird thing that evolution has been around for 2 billion years, and with humans it stops. We've arrived. This is it. This is the end point of evolution. So transhumanism is a philosophical movement that the people who are transhumanists advocate and predict the enhancement of the human condition mostly through technology. And these technologies will enhance longevity, our behavioral characteristics, our moods, our performance, even our cognitive abilities. And I think that the whole idea of transhumanism is that with the advent or the incorporation of technology, that we are actually becoming something different than human. And that then brings us to the concept of post-humanism. What will that species be called? And of course, there are people who think that that's just crazy, and and we are humans, and that's the way it is. But when you compare a human today to a human 200 years ago, it's almost like we're different species. We have different ways of interacting. We have different ways of working with the external world. We have different issues of survival. We have different ways in which we reflect upon who we are and how we relate to others. And the idea of transhumanism is that we are at a between point. And in many ways, and I've mentioned here, I think a few times, the work of Marshall McLuhan, who is absolutely significantly important in understanding transhumanism, even though many transhumanists do not know that they know anything about Marshall McLuhan. And I'm just going to briefly touch on this, but Marshall McLuhan was considered to be a media guru in the late 1960s in the mid 60s through the early 70s. That was his height. He was a professor. He was an academic. He was a professor at McGill University in Montreal. And he stumbled onto a few things that really changed a lot of the way we look at who we are. And because he was so brilliant at encapsulating, I think is the word, encapsulating ideas into these short, what's the right word? Just media blips, that he really became like a very well-known character in the late 60s and into the 70s. And some of the things that he coined, one of his books was called The Medium is the Massage, which people interpreted as the medium is the message, which is exactly what he meant, because this guy was a James Joyce scholar and loved James Joyce's puns that came to a height in his last book, Finnegan's Wake. And so the medium is the massage McLuhan basically stated that humans create technology, and then technology recreates humans. And he goes all the way back in history and says that every piece of technology that humans have ever developed are actually based upon a biological function that we externalize and then we manufacture for social use. And it's kind of a crazy thought, but it's like the house is an externalization of our skin. It's a biological function. A wheel is like a rotary foot. A camera is like an externalization of our eye, and so on and so on. And McLuhan actually traces history by the breakthroughs of technology and makes observations that I don't think anyone prior to him made before. I mean, we all know, for example, that the Mongol horde came in from the east and under Genghis Khan took over the law. Yeah, and we know about this. We know how badass they were. But someone forgot to tell us that they had stirrups. And no one prior to them ever had stirrups, which gave them a superiority on the battlefield with horses. I mean, these little things about technology, okay? So bringing this around to transhumanism, McLuhan, one of his books was a brilliant, well, no, let me just finish a couple of other words that he coined. He coined the word flipped out. You know, we use that word, oh man, I was flipped out. Well, McLuhan basically said that if every technology is an externalization of a biological function, computers are the externalization of our brain and our nervous systems. Now, understand, McLuhan died before the World Wide Web popped. But he said that with the advent of electronic and digital media, that what has happened is that we've externalized our nervous system so that as a species, we now have an exonervous system, just like a crab has an exoskeleton. We have an exonervous system. Our nervous system is out there, and it is the web of all the electronic and digital communication that's, you know, radio and television and internet and all these frequencies that are just humming around us all the time. And McLuhan wrote a book about this shift, and the name of his book, and this was the first use of the word that we're going to hear in the title of his book. The name of this book that he wrote, and I'm guessing this was probably maybe 68 or 69. I may be off a year or two. But it was called War and Peace in the Global Village. And now we've all heard of the concept of the global village, like flipped out, and like the medium is and with the medium is the medium is the message. McLuhan's point is it doesn't matter what we're reading. The fact that we read has changed our sensory mechanisms so that seeing became believing. Prior to reading, we lived in this acoustic, multisensorial environment that he called pre-literate man, and pre-literate humans were fully engaged in the moment. But when reading came, in his first major academic work in this whole scenario, and trust me, we are leading to transhumanism, because again, understanding McLuhan basically makes understanding transhumanism obvious. But McLuhan's first breakthrough book that was a huge academic treatise, and it was entitled The Gutenberg Galaxy. And the Gutenberg Galaxy was a study in how the mass production of the printed word changed everything, because it introduced the concept of point of view. Prior to that, when you read, you put something out there and you look at it. And the visual sense, you have to have perspective. And in fact, it was after the printing press that perspective came into art through Italy, through Venice in that period of time. It was the rise of ideologies and nation states, because they're all about points of view rather than a particular person who was the head of the state. And there's many, many ramifications of this, but it was the idea that seeing is believing when you read. Doesn't matter what you're reading. The fact is that we became a culture where if you read it, it was true. And it also then created in the universities, it created this distance between humans and nature, which we call, this is the age of enlightenment, but it's the magification, if that's a word, the enchantment. Thomas More wrote about this. It's about how the academic movement that began after the invention of the printing press basically separated humans from nature, so that nature was separate and something to be overcome, something to be fixed, something to be dealt with, something to be managed. So in McLuhan's many brilliant breakthroughs, one of the things that he describes is that that machines are not separate from nature. We think of that machines as something mechanical and something that's not natural. We made them. And McLuhan says, how can something that nature creates, that's created in nature, I mean, humans are natural. If a bee makes a beehive, we don't say that's unnatural. We say that bees created that and they're part of nature and what they create is natural. And yet somehow we think machines are unnatural. And McLuhan says, maybe machines are a new phylum in the order of things, just like there were invertebrates and vertebrates and mammals and all these different, orders, crustaceans, and then down to maybe machines are actually a new phylum called Machinus. And maybe the humans are the honeybees of the machine world. Ooh. Just like bees keep the flower world going, maybe that humans, the function of humans is to keep the machinist species, not species, but phylum that going. So this puts a very different perspective on, how can humans, that's so unnatural. Plastic is unnatural. No, plastic is natural. It may be offensive to us. It may be horrific in what it does in the environment. It may be disturbing. And a lot of things about evolution are disturbing because they're one-way streets that create new things. So this idea of transhumanism as a philosophical movement that talks about the enhancement of the human condition by sophisticated technologies, I go back to the hinge. Was an invention some 4,000 years ago that changed everything, because all of a sudden you could have doors. You could have separation Saturn, that the door still opened. You could go through it, but it didn't lose its integrity. And therefore you could have the ability to lock things up. You could have families. You could have cities that had doors. The hinge was a major thing. But the fact that we as humans now live our daily lives in a way that's so different than we did 100 years ago, what is human and what is changing? Now, the biggest thing, of course, that is changing is the advent of the externalization of the brain, the computer, and the re-assimilation of that. How do we, the dividing line between internal and external has disintegrated. We've talked about that here in the past, about how Saturn used to be the absolute finality. It was the boundary. There was nothing past Saturn. And then all of a sudden our minds were blown kapow. There was Uranus. And then Neptune, and then Pluto, and then wait, there are other galaxies. Holy crap, there are millions of other galaxies. Not only that, there are other stars that have planets going, it's way bigger than we thought. So we've busted through this thing. At the same time, we have very real technology that already exists widely. People have hearing aids. So these people who are wearing hearing aids are transhumans. They're, when you sit down at your computer and dial into your exo nervous system, into your external brain, and have communication links going all over the planet. And what does that mean? You hit Google or Bing or whatever you use, and all of a sudden you have this almost like the Alexandrian library of information in front of you. Humans didn't have that. Humans basically, in the past were isolated. They were taught by a teacher until books came. If you owned a bookstore in Florence during the Renaissance in the 15th century, if you owned a bookstore, you know what that meant? That meant you had 6 books on the shelf and you employed 10 people who wrote them by hand when someone ordered one. That's it. That's what happened. Did you say wow? I didn't hear you. Do I not have
wow? I didn't say it out loud because of the echo.
Oh, are we still getting an echo? Oh.
Yes. We
Okay.
weren't, but now we're not. It's gone. But I said, wow, I mouthed it because wow.
So even that, I mean, again, to think that, and when Gutenberg printed the first book, the Bible, he was pretty sure that that was the only book that would ever be printed. What other book could be relevant enough to be, it was like when IBM invented or first made the first, business computer. What other purpose could it ever have other than running a government or a business?
Wow.
And both the invention of the printing press and the IBM System 36 both occurred on Uranus-Pluto conjunctions. One in 1455 when Gutenberg printed the first Bible, and one in 1966 when IBM came out with the System 36, first self-contained computer that had all the software and everything. You bought a computer and you used it to run your business. But Gutenberg couldn't have imagined, small printing presses, and I don't know how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books are carried in Amazon right now, and how many new books are written daily, weekly, monthly. By the same token, it wasn't until the World Wide Web hit that anyone at IBM ever thought that, holy smokes, this is not just about computers running businesses. This is about linking up every brain on the planet with every other brain on the planet. And people say transhumanism doesn't exist. I say we are already different than our ancestors were in ways that are invisible to us, just like they say, actually another McLuhanism, environments are invisible, he wrote. The fish cannot see the water. Okay,
Wow.
so that's our opening volley, which has nothing to do with transhumanism other than it sets the tone for now we are doing cochlear implants so that people who could never hear, not a hearing aid, but we're now linking microprocessors into the brain so people can hear and or see for the first time. We are actually able to stimulate nerves so that people who are paralyzed actually can walk. And now, where does this go? And man, there's some brilliant literature around on what all this is. But the fact of the matter is that this whole movement scares the crap out of people who want things to be as great as they were when they were a childhood. And of course, I've said here, I said that was when they were in their childhood. And I've said here many times that there's a basic concept in psychodynamic psychology, depth psychology, called infantile regression, which basically says under pressure, we go back to wanting it so nice and comfortable so that we just had warmth and milk at the breast and everything was just perfect when things really weren't necessarily perfect. But that's the way the mind works. It wants to go back to the past. And I would suggest that a lot of the political things that we're seeing going on right now are rooted in the fear of transhumanism, even though most of those people would never acknowledge that because most of them don't even know that there's something called transhumanism. It's just this innate fear that we're losing our humanness.
Right. Yes, but what is the humanness? I think that's the interesting question. Like, what humanness? I mean, because this transhuman movement, I'm calling it that, but from what you just described, I mean, we've actually been in that movement for a very, very, very long time. It's just maybe becoming accelerated and more obvious or something, because, people at some point, that echoes back, Rick. It like goes off and on. I don't know if anybody else hears it, but there's chips that can be put into the brain, and just like in the Matrix, and this is where it would be going, is that we'd be able to like download an entire program and be able to know things and do things that before it would have taken an entire lifetime to learn how to do. We could potentially at the click of a button be like in the Matrix when what does he say? Tai Chi or he learned something really quick. Anyways.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole idea of being able to take our entire quote unquote consciousness and put it into a quote unquote robotic body. So it's this blurring of the line of where and what is a human, what makes us human, what differentiates us between being a human or being a machine.
Right.
And what things do we lose about being human if we continue going in this direction?
And what things do we gain?
And what things do we gain?
Is the echo gone?
Yes.
Oh, good. Right, okay. Yes. All right. No, I fixed it.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is
I'm a transhumanist.
But I mean, think about the amount of information we have access to now. It would have taken many, many lifetimes to ever get exposed to all the information that we can get right now at a few clicks of a button. So, yeah. I mean, I hear your point that we're already in it because many of us were born at this time. Like if someone just plopped in from centuries ago, they would maybe even think we already are, quote unquote.
So science fiction is a great place where we can see the potentials of the future. And I've been a major science fiction buff, fan, nut, whatever since my childhood. And there is an author that many people might know the name, even if they've never read any of his books. Not very prolific. He's probably written maybe 8 or 10 books, and his name is William Gibson. Does that name ring any bells?
No.
So William Gibson actually developed a genre of science fiction that didn't exist prior to his first book. His first book was called Necromancer. And Necromancer was kind of like Matrix 15 years before the movie. Because Necromancer, I shouldn't even say before the movie, it was, let me just think, it was a good 10 years before the internet. And in the book Necromancer, William Gibson coined the word cyberspace. He made it up. It's his word. No question about it at all. That's his word. And the protagonist in the book was one of many people who were like cowboys that basically went out to ride the cyber ranges. And they had their cowpoke assistants that would stay back and manage their body. And these people would, and I love William Gibson's a brilliant linguist. And he said they trode it up like electrodes, but it was like the assistant, there's a word for it. The cowboys had kind of a sidekick. Their sidekick would basically trode them up, and then they would manage the body while they were out riding the ranges in cyberspace. This is before there was an internet.
Wow.
All right. So William Gibson developed a genre of science fiction that's actually sometimes called it's sometimes called punk fiction, or cyberpunk is a one of the words, and it's sometimes defined as high tech, low life.
Huh.
And some of Gibson's books take place in the back alleys of Hong Kong in like 2050. That kind of era where there's stuff going on that's one of his favorite words, that's liminal. We all know the word like subliminal advertising, but liminal is like Saturn. It's the edge. It's the limit. And those liminal areas are the invisible places. They're not here. They're not there. They're in-betweeners. And, but the point here is that science fiction often looks at these issues, way ahead. And Gibson has been doing this consistently for, I think, about 30 years now. But he, in a way, was one of the people who began to realize what some of the potentials were going to be when we begin to incorporate digital, what's the word I'm looking for? Digital / organic interfaces. That the interface between what I'm going to call crystal mechanics. And what I mean by crystals, I mean semiconductors, because they are crystals of silicon and gallium arsenide and other metallic substances. We forget that, the old crystal radios, that the way you made a radio is you took a piece of quartz and you cut off a wafer, because quartz has piezoelectric or electrical properties, and you basically took two pieces of wire and used the quartz as a dielectric, as a way of getting the circuit that would allow you to get a radio. All radios at one point in time were crystal radios. But coming to the future, or back to where we are now, we have this digital technology that has now gone into size, scaling tools that have allowed us to create nanotechnology. And nanotechnology is basically technology that is so small that a virus, for example, is a piece of nanotechnology that we might not have made. Maybe we did, but maybe we didn't. But it's at that scale we're talking about, at the molecular scale of making machines, so that you can actually make a machine that could be injected into the human bloodstream that would find its way to a certain cell of a particular type of cancer and then reside there and release something that would be a poison for that cell, or that would actually cut through cholesterol. I mean, you could, these nanotechnological machines are crazy as to what they're actually doing at the molecular level, making little pinchers so that with kind of computer aided visuals, you can go into the body and actually maneuver these things that are submicroscopic levels of tools. Now, what does this have to do with transhumanism? Everything, because we're on the verge of re-engineering the human body, which has already begun. It's begun with what we call GMOs, and we've seen a huge split in the culture itself. Half of the culture, a part of the culture, maybe much less than half, totally embracing this idea of gene splicing and going in and taking genes and cutting them apart and mixing a gene of a fish with a gene of a tomato so that it doesn't rot on the shelves, so that we have square tomatoes that don't rot, because they pack better than round tomatoes. This is all part of, as transhumanism, these things that we're now doing externally, to salmon, to tomatoes, to certainly right these days to wheat and corn and soy in particular. If you're not getting organic wheat, soy, and and what was the third? And corn, chances are, matter of fact, it's not just chances are, it's almost certainly been genetically modified. And it's been genetically modified so that it doesn't react to the poisons that are the series of chemicals called glyphosates, which kill other things. And so that allows farmers to use these genetically modified, seeds, so that our agriculture can grow things in environments that do not have, like insects and things that can, eat them, and caterpillars and things of that sort. But of course, what that means is that we're eating food that has been altered genetically. Now, so far, and that in itself may be hugely problematic. And I'm not getting into that discussion, but it's probably obvious what side of that argument or discussion I would fall on. But that's not our discussion today, because that's already going on. It's hugely widespread. But the next layer of this becomes doing that type of genetic modification to us individually, with technologies like using messenger RNA to alter the defense mechanisms, the immune system of the body. And I'm not saying that any one of these things is all good or all bad. I'm not saying that machines are bad. but everything has its price. And we often, because we're moving so fast these days, I don't think that we stop long enough to know what the price of a cloned mammal or livestock or food is, which is another form of technology. We don't know what the downside of doing some sort of cerebral implants, which will happen. You know, one of the most mind-blowing books I've read in years. Now, it's probably been 8 years since I've read it, I'm guessing. Written by a Seattle guy who I actually know. His name is Ramez Nan, and Ramez is he's a retired Microsoft technologist who actually wrote a book on biological enhancement, which is a form of, in effect, it's like artificial intelligence, but it's using computer technology to enhance the biology, whether it's optical, auditory, whether it's logical, whether it's physical. These things are all real. And so this guy is, already an authority on that. But then he wrote a series of novels. And if you want your mind blown right off the maps, I think it's a trilogy, and I think there's already 4 books in the trilogy, which I know sounds funny. But the first book is a book called Nexus, Nexus. And Nexus is an absolute mind blower because it takes place in 2040, which is close enough to feel like the day after tomorrow. And there's a huge battle going on the national presidential political level of candidates who are absolutely anti-transhumanism and proponents of a drug that had just been made illegal in this book because it was like a nanotechnology version of an entheogenic substance like an LSD, except what it did was when you took it, it allowed you to share a hive mind with other people so that you have experiences that are now outside of the individual, not hallucination, but real. And the government shut that down. But, who uses stuff that's made illegal when it's cool? Well, outlaws who are already in trouble and students. And so there's a group of graduate students at Stanford University. And I'm not going to give away anything in this book because it's a thriller. But these students at Stanford University have developed a new iteration of this drug called Nexus. And they've figured out a way to actually download a simplistic operating system into the drug while it's resident in the brain. And it's nanotechnology, so it kind of stays there. Which means that if you have taken this drug, you're no longer human because, if you're walking down an alley and all of a sudden you see that there's 3 nasty looking people, you just go to your operating system and you download off the wireless internet or whatever you want to call it. You download your Bruce Lee routine and you have that software. And the book is stunning because it's a worldwide, I call them spy-fi thrillers instead of, they're it's not sci-fi, it's spy-fi, meaning that there's, that it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But point being that this book brings so many of these issues very close to home, and it leaves you not knowing which side of the fence you're really on, because it's way more complicated. In this book, there's a whole scenario of this dictator in China who's actually downloaded her husband's consciousness into a computer, and he was the mastermind of this whole. I mean, it's crazy where all this is going. And how far will it go? Well, it's going to go as far as it can if we don't extinguish ourselves on the way, which is always a possibility, but I don't necessarily I think if we extinguish ourselves, we will extinguish chunks of ourselves and things will keep going. But this is really where we are on the larger scenario of things. And this is why I believe that we are not in the Age of Aquarius. I think that the Age of Aquarius is a good 100 years away. There are astrologers who would argue with me, and that's fine, but we have no way of gauging the cusp or the starting point of something that's 26,000 years long without knowing the time of birth. In other words, we don't have a starting point. But certainly when we talk about transhumanism into post-humanism, there will be different species. Just, back to William Gibson and this is why I thought of him originally, and I never made this punchline. William Gibson has said or written, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. You got that? It's a brilliant line. You see, because we are entering a world of cyber haves and cyber have nots. If anyone has ever seen the movie or read the book, and the book is much better than the movie, of The Time Machine, written over 100 years ago by H.G. Wells, the Time Machine has this guy building this time machine going into the future, undisclosed how far, and he discovers a world where there are two different species of humans. There are the Eloi and the Morlock. The Morlocks live underground and they maintain the machinery. It's like living in the tubes of London or the sewers of France. It's like dark and deep, and these guys all have wrenches, and they seem to be all men. I don't know that they really are, but these are almost like the dirty blue collar workers of the planet. And I don't mean that blue collar workers are dirty. I'm just saying that in this book, these guys are operating the machinery of the planet. They don't ever go onto the surface. On the surface, there's a different species who live, and those are the Eloi. And the Eloi are basically, you can think of them as an extension of the flower children hippies of the 60s. But of course, this book was written 50 years prior to that. And these people are basically, they're love, they're peace, they're simple-minded. Food is always there for them. Why? Because the Morlock underneath are basically making all of the machinery produce whatever it is for them on the top. And this division between two different species living simultaneously is apparently where we are going, where we have some people who are either can afford or are willing to move into a future where they will lose some of their humanness in return, almost like the proverbial Faustian deal with the devil, where in return they'll be extra strong, or they'll be extra smart. I mean, they're already, you can go down to your health food store and buy, off the counter things that kind of stimulate your mind and make you smarter than you were, or at least appear that way. You may get stupider elsewhere, but this is all part of this whole transhumanistic movement. And just doing one full circle back to Bucky Fuller, back to Marshall McLuhan, because it's so significant in all of this. And that is, McLuhan in the Gutenberg galaxy said that Gutenberg actually created the modern world as we knew it, where there was cause and effect and disassociation from nature and ideological point of views, and seeing is believing, and blah, blah, so many other things. Emotional detachment, the rise of the patriarchy, because when we look at linear alphabets, that's basically a function of the left brain, right hand. But once the digital technologies, once the exonervous system began to occur, and this really began with the advent of radio and television. They're both electronic media that are not about reading a book. And the first generation that grew up with television was the generation that became the hippies and the flower children of the 60s. And McLuhan said that it was not what they were watching on TV. It was the fact that they were watching TV, not reading books, that created what he called a post-literate society. Pre-literate, the ancient tribal drums, the everything engaged, the rituals of the moment, all of that kind of reflourished with the digital technology, even though it had been overlooked and set aside and was marginalized. That as the music, and the music of the 60s actually was those tribal drums. It was, in a way, if anyone in control had realized that the music of the 60s wasn't just music, that it actually was a retribalization of the species, that if you grew up in the 60s, you were a different animal than your parents or grandparents, because you experienced the same buzz of vibrations that someone did, whether they grew up in Paris, Langdon, North Dakota, Venezuela, or New York City. It didn't matter. You all basically got the buzz as it occurred, and therefore it was like listening to the tribal drums, and therefore there was this whole rebirth of the multiple senses rather than seeing is believing. Now, this is just one facet of McLuhan, but it's very interesting that now we enter the World Wide Web, and now we enter a realm where we have digitally enhanced reality. Hell, I already have that on my phone. I can using Google Assistant, I can aim it at something at a store, and I can just, by aiming it at something, I can get a list of where the prices are at every store around, what it is, who made it, and we're going to see more and more of that. And although there have been a couple of attempts and none of them have really worked really well, we're going to see those in eyeglasses. Absolutely. I mean, the technology is there. You remember, there was a technology for computer tablets 20 years before the iPad. And there were several stabs at it, but no one got it. No one made it so that it was just easy to use. And now, I mean, our telephones are like little tablets. The amount of intelligence that a phone has is greater than the original IBM, System 36 that revolutionized the business world. And so we are there. But as these exo objects, these telephones and tablets and glasses, they will be internalized. They might be made illegal in the United States, for a time, for ethical reasons, or, but that's not going to stop it from happening on the back streets. Again, I'm not picking on Hong Kong. It's just that William Gibson used that because they're so technologically advanced. I mean, much of the Western technology now resides in the manufacturing in China and in Hong Kong. So this is where we're going, like it or not. And the resistance to this kind of evolution is not new. In the 1800s, there was a huge movement called the Luddite movement. And Luddites were basically people who were violently against the Industrial Revolution. They were violent. They would destroy factories that had machines in them because they were considered to be anti-human.
Oh. Wow.
So why are we talking about this? Tell us a little bit about, you had mentioned before we started that you got this bug that, quite frankly, I've had forever. And I can't emphasize strongly enough that Ramez Nam, he's born in Cairo, but he's a Seattleite. Mez's book, Nexus, It's available on Kindle. It's available paperback. If when you get to the end of it, like I did, you want more, there's a book 2 and a book 3. Nexus, what is it? Crux and Apex. But they're all about this culture that begins to develop as the government is suppressing the technology, and the people who are really engaged in a battle way larger than they ever planned on, because they're now fighting for their lives around the planet, because the people in control do not want people to have this, because A, of their fear of what they're creating, and B, what happens when you get people together who actually can love as a beehive rather than as 30,000 separate bees.
Well, to answer your question, I am taking a course. I can't remember exactly the name, but it's like Human Consciousness and Technology and Evolution or something. It's taught by Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, and Lynn McTaggart. And it's put on by Humanities, I don't know, something. Anyways, it's really fascinating. And Greg Braden has been going into the details of what is already available. Like, it's mind-blowing. I mean, people are having robots for children. They're not having children. They're just having an infant robot that doesn't cry and wake you up in the middle of the night. You don't have to change diapers, but you get kind of like, I guess, the feeling of having a baby.
Or kind of like having a pet rock, only
right. But it looks, I don't know. It's, yeah. People marrying robots. A lot less emotional things you got to deal with. The person wants to do what you want to do at the time you want to do it. And he showed a picture of a man who had just married a robot. I think it was in Japan. I'm not totally sure. And you can't tell the difference between the human and the robot. I mean, the robot looks that human. He showed pictures of the technologies that are getting implanted into the brain and what that is going to be allowing. And then there was, also the gene therapy, where you can literally delete or zap out certain genes of a baby and be like, I want the baby to have blue eyes, not, whatever it is. And the thing that he's bringing up that's really fascinating is exactly what you said. We literally externalize biology, and we create all these machines that are doing things that we actually can already do. We just don't know it. And we don't actually know how to use it. And so the point he's making, right, wrong, or indifferent, he's not giving a judgment on what's happening, is just, don't you kind of want to know what you're actually capable of without having to do all those things? And wouldn't it be amazing if we actually were utilizing our, he called it soft technology, to its highest capacity? And so it's a very interesting philosophical exploration right now. I just started. But Rick, the first time that any of this transhumanism thing even came into my awareness was about 4 years ago. I went to London for a similar thing. I was with Natasha Alter, the astrologer who gave me my first reading. We met in London for this conference. Greg Braden was one of the speakers. And it was a conference called something like Human Technology and Evolution.
Greg used to live in Seattle. I know Greg from before he ever thought about writing a book.
Amazing. Yeah, he's such a cool guy.
And as you know, Bruce also is someone who I know well. Lynn's work I know, but I've never met her. But yeah, that's a good trio.
It's a great trio. Fascinating. So I met someone in London, Natasha and I. He called himself Jack Out of the Box. He was this 6'8", larger than life human being, totally magnetic, and just literally there was a group of people just following this man around London all night. At one point, I was there, obviously. He was wearing this necklace that had this huge gold medallion on his chest. On the necklace. It was like this huge gold thing. It was really weird looking. And I said, "What is that?" He said, "Oh, well, it's a device that's recording every single thing that happens, every voice, every movement, everything." I was like, "Why would you want to do that?" He goes, "Well, because at some point we're going to be able to recreate consciousness or take human consciousness and put it into robotic bodies. And then people won't have to suffer anymore, and you'll never die, and you won't have any illness. And I just went, oh my God. I mean, it creeped me out. I couldn't believe that this was actually a real thing. Went home, did research, realized it's actually a real thing. And people are, it's way more advanced than we would ever believe.
It's way more advanced, and so is robotic technology, as you've stated. I've seen, matter of fact, this month's Wired magazine has a very brilliant article on this new person who's been somewhat the guru of creating robots with facial features that are nearly indistinguishable from a human, in both talking, eye movement, nuanced twitches, and so on. But although that also was totally foreshadowed in science fiction by one of my childhood heroes, a guy named Isaac Asimov, who wrote close to 300 books in his lifetime, and about half of them were science and about half of them were science fiction. I mean, I grew up reading every Asimov book I could get, both his factual science stuff, the realm of numbers, the realm of mathematics, the, space and discovery, how the body works. He wrote, if you ever saw that Disney thing, Fantastic Voyage, where they get miniaturized and they go through the human body. Well, that was from a book that Isaac Asimov wrote. And in fact, the greatest science fiction trilogy maybe of all times, called the Foundation Trilogy, which many people say Star Wars not was a ripoff, but it was Asimov's Foundation Trilogy that created the concept that allowed a George Lucas to create Star Wars. But Asimov wrote a book called I, Robot, which became another Disney movie. But he wrote probably 10 or 20 other robot stories, books and short stories, in which he developed what he called the 3 laws of robotics, which now, crazy enough, is being used in creating the programs for robots. They're basically using Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. I mean, it's nuts how science fiction basically does predate science fiction. And I have to say here, just very briefly, I may have said this before, but back in 1969 or 1970, I wrote the following couplet, and it goes like this: science fiction has become science faction, but look at the robots, they have no reaction.
Mm. And this brings us back to the Age of Aquarius.
It sure does.
Whether or not we're there right now, it kind of doesn't matter because we know where we're going, right? And the shadow side of an Aquarian energy, right, would be completely detached emotionally, no real compassion or empathy, none of those things that I believe make us distinctly human.
Hold on. Let's call all of those things wet.
Wet.
It's the astrological water.
Yes.
It's the wetware. I mean, it's actually sometimes referred to as wetware, is what's in our brain, because Aquarius is air. It carries water, but it's dry.
Right.
No emotion.
Have you seen that science fiction movie? I cannot remember it. I'm sure someone knows in the chat. Please, if you know this movie. It's about the last human. The last human on Earth is getting interviewed by someone else who can't even fathom things like falling in love or having your first kiss or being really, really angry or any of the passion. They're interviewing this final human on Earth because it's so foreign to them, all these things that we take for granted as part of the human experience. And it's amazing how quickly these things can change. They can change in a generation. The people born today who will never know a time without smartphones, will never know a time without the internet, will never know a time where you can't just get information at the click of a few buttons, and how quickly things can change over time. Yeah. So we bring this up today not to provide any answers, really. It's really to open up a philosophical conversation that could actually become a time where we as individuals have to make choices about which direction we would like to align with. And I think that it's a good one to couch in the astrological conversation, because we can learn a lot from the archetypal energies of.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I know I've said this before. Matter of fact, I think you might have a link to our discussion on the Age of Aquarius. But when we talked about that, I absolutely believe that most people who think of the Age of Aquarius, especially those coming from the musical Hair and this whole idea of the hippie movement creating the flower children and that whole peace and love and rainbows and unicorns, and there's no shadow.
Right.
And the Age of Aquarius, or let me just say Aquarius, like every sign, even Sagittarius, you Sagittarians out there, every sign has a shadow. Some of them it's harder to find. And I know that when we talked about Aquarius, or the Age of Aquarius, I talked about, perfect, the idea of Capricorn to Aquarius is Capricorn is built on hierarchy. Capricorn is built on the mountain goat trying to get to the top of the mountain, and the sea goat, the dolphin, going to the bottom, so that there's actually this hierarchy, and Capricorns live to get ahead by creating dominance, by getting altitude, if you will. It may not be physical altitude, it can be intellectual altitude, but it's power, control, and it's getting above the fray. That's what Capricorn is all about. And in a Capricorn society, which Capricorn is organization, we have this whole stratification of society where we have people in control and power at the top, and then we have the controlled or the excluded minority segments, the have-nots at the bottom. This is a Capricornian distribution. Now, people go, well, that's all going to change because in the Age of Aquarius, Aquarius is equanimity. There is no hierarchy because Aquarius is a network. And on a network, the strength of the network is in the number of connections each node makes. Mm. Remember, a point on a network is a node. Just like in astrology, the point at which a vibration becomes real, like the node of the moon, where two vibrations intersect. But on a network, you're a node, I'm a node, this computer's a node, that person, every person is a node on the network. And in Aquarius, the network is not stratified this way. There is this kind of equality, the humanity of Aquarius, the equality of the sexes of Aquarius, that whole idea of equanimity, of things being in balance. And I go, yes, that's wonderful. Let's take a look at a perfect Aquarian society. How about a termite hill? Or an ant colony? Or a beehive? These are brilliant Aquarian societies where there is no individuality. And as far as we know, there's no emotion like we feel emotion. There is basically a plug into this equally stratified system where everything works, and it works magically and harmoniously and beautifully. And in fact, the upside is that there very well could be this amazing bee consciousness that we humans can't even grasp at how magnificent it is to buzz as part of this larger consciousness, that even though you as a worker bee may be born, may do your thing and die, you are part of a consciousness that is not You don't have that separation like we humans do in the age of Pisces, where there's the illusion of the separation of the individual from the collective. Now, the only reason why I'm bringing this up is that, again, this whole idea of the Age of Aquarius is going to solve everything because there won't be any minorities. We'll all be equal. We'll all be like the colors of the rainbow and everything will be perfect. And that's true, but it may not be the perfect that you're thinking here as a wet software, wetware human, because there is something else. And of course, I've said this before, and for anyone who's watched the original or the early Star Treks, they know about Borg, and Borg is this kind of very advanced consciousness. And when you meet a person who is of the Borg race, and you say to that person, I'm, Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise, who are you? That person will say, we are Borg. There is no I. And in fact, they will say, we are Borg, you shall be assimilated. Okay, so this is Aquarius. This is transhumanism, posthumanism, and the technology. We haven't even talked about computer augmented reality. Right. Which is already existent. I've had some experiences with technology where I've put on the reality glasses and the headphones, and holy shit, all of a sudden I was in a different world. And that will become more and more prevalent, and that will then become mixed with real, with what we now call real. So we won't even be able to necessarily know what's internal and what's external. Of course, a case can be made these days that there's nothing external anyhow, that, the famous Anais Nin quote, we don't see reality as it is, we see reality as we are.
Rick, I'm not asking you to tell us what to do. I would never do that. And I know you.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Ask
no,
me.
I'm not going to. I'm going to ask a different way. So I guess, what are things to keep in mind as we continue down this path? I mean, is it the whole flexible bamboo kind of thing, or I don't know. I guess, how are you navigating it? How do you think about it?
Well, if you'd asked me the question of what you should do, my answer was, I don't effing know.
Exactly.
And I think that that's a good way. I've said this in other contexts before, in reference to a lot of things. And that is, anyone who thinks they know doesn't. Mm-hmm. And it's, this whole thing is like when you mix tin with copper, they're both malleable and soft. And when you mix them together, heat them, they become what's called an alloy. And when that cools, it's no longer malleable and soft, nor is it reheatable to mold. That's where we are culturally right now.
Wow.
I don't know where we're going to end up. I know that we're still a bit malleable. Right. And I think that it's real important to stay aware and to be aware. But even in the act of pushing your awareness and learning, you're making a decision that is in some way moving toward Eloi rather than the Morlock. The future computer whatever versus the go back to the past. I think that there are a lot of people who are so afraid of what the future might bring, or maybe of what the future will bring, that they are absolutely dead set against even acknowledging any of the pieces of what might become any of the pieces of information that might become real. These are people who don't want gene therapy, or who are anti this and anti that. And again, it's tricky because one might say, I'm not for gene modification, in the food that I eat, because it's not proven as to what will happen or what it does to me. But does that mean I'm against technology? The whole technology thing it's an incredibly slippery slope. And we have to remember that because we now live in that McLuhan-esque global village, just because we make something illegal. I mean, there was a time that if America made something illegal, well, it was almost like we enforced it around the planet. That's the way it was. That ain't the way it is anymore. And so we don't have the ability to call the shots. And there are other cultures that have very different flavors and tastes of what colonial imposition of reality might be onto another culture. And this is part of where we are. It's a very exciting place. It's very daunting. It may be terrifying if we try to hold on to the past, but then again, if you took your great great grandparent and plunked them into today, they would not recognize it. And yeah, there might be some that might go, wow, this is really cool. I would say that most of them might go, this isn't life. What have you lost?
Yes, I agree.
So I think it's just part. It's just part of the process. Get over it.
I love what Carol says. Carol says, I think I need to go sit in my garden, possibly naked. And Teal says, we need no one to tell us, only follow our innate guidance.
I think both of those are true. It's one of the reasons why I love places like Brighton Bush Hot Springs in Oregon, where you actually are in the midst of old growth forest and you can lay in hot tubs naked and feel like, and there is no internet there. There is no internet. There is no cell phone reception, or being on some little island off the coast of Africa or Indonesia or Thailand. We have to go places to get that, but we can also go, if we live in New York City, even though it's not quite the same, we can go to Central Park. There are places where we can go and find some peace. And I think more and more, though, we also rely on technology to do that. We put on our binaural beats or our low frequency, that puts us at ease, or we watch a movie or listen to some music. But it's all about how we control our feedback. And I think that part of what do we do now is we pay attention. We manage ourselves the best we can. Look, I know people, I'm sure you know people that are sensitive enough that if they're in the range of a cell phone, their whole nervous system freaks out. I know people who have had to move, to places like in northern Idaho or in the deserts of Arizona, where there is not a lot of interference, not because they want to, but because they can't survive, in the noise of the hum of the high frequency energy of the cities. Back to McLuhan, one of the books he wrote was a brilliant book. It was mostly pictures with sayings, but the name of the book was called Counterblast. And the book was basically about, with the advent of putting satellites into orbit around the Earth, the entire Earth has become an art form. In other words, it's not like it once was. McLuhan also says, another brilliant McLuhan-esque line, McLuhan says that historically, artists were the sensitive people who could see what's going on and reflect reality. And that historically, the artist lived in the ivory tower where they absorbed and reflected reality. But now, because things are moving so fast, the artist has moved from the ivory tower to the control tower. It's a brilliant line. And you think about the artists who are, who have in fact, changed from that quiet, passive reflection to being involved. I mean, you look at someone like John Lennon, just comes to mind, but certainly, more contemporaneously, there are many entertainers and or artists whose life is really about, here's someone who has a sense of what's going on. Bob Dylan, during his heyday, people weren't listening to Bob Dylan because they thought he was a good musician. They were listening to Bob Dylan because they wanted to know what the hell was going on. And Dylan was somehow reflecting it. So The point is that things are moving so quickly. We need to pay attention to those people that can help us reflect back to us what's going on. And again, I'm not making a commission on this, but Ramez, Mesnam's book, Nexus, is one of those books that really helps us see the dark side of what is evolving. And hopefully we won't read it and then all turn into digital Luddites, where we're going to want to burn, every factory that's making autonomous cars. Because there's another whole thing of, super, or not super, but posthumanism, is the idea, look, I'm in Aries with Mars in Aries. I love to drive my car. The thought of being in a car that someone else is driving is bad enough, but being in a car that is driven by some consciousness that's just getting me from place A to place B, that to me is frightening. I don't want to lose that control. Right. And yet, whether it's in one or two generations, we will have people who say, do you know that in olden days, people actually steered cars? Can you imagine what that must have been frightening?
It's all about perspective. It's really, really interesting. Well, Rick, thank you. This has been so fun. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. And it seems to me like something we'll be exploring together as a community.
I don't think we have any choice.
Time. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what I mean. Like, for a long time, these are going to be some of the biggest issues of our time. And hopefully we'll be able to make individual choice. Like, that to me is the ideal situation where people can choose what they want to engage with and what they don't want to engage with and how far they want to take it. And I think, again, couching it in the astrological awareness, because yes, of course, there's shadow side to every single sign, everything. So it's just being aware. It's being aware of it. And then we can actually make choice.
It's having the courage to explore the awareness so we can make informed decisions and to pick our battles where they matter rather than just where the fear comes up.
Right.
Because sometimes the fear comes up for one reason that's not anything to do with what's going on. It's a much different set of issues.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Rick, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Thanks to all of you, all of your comments in the chat. Everyone was really, really engaged. So
I don't look at the chat when we're on because I have a hard enough time staying focused on what we're talking about. Before we go, I would like to remind people that they can get my daily blurb through what I call my daily planet pulse. Best place to find that is on Instagram, and it's Rick Levine Astrologer on Instagram. And just mention that in passing.
They're awesome. Check it out. If you're not already subscribed, they're so great. Rick, I read them every day. I'm pretty sure I read them every day.
So you're the one. You're the one.
Yes, I am. I think I have some friends, and I love the visuals. Like, you have some great art on the top of each of the posts. That
I do all those myself. It's my love. I do all the typographics. I used to take all the photos, but I go back and forth between no, I didn't. But the stock photo libraries are so brilliant now. But I basically every day, that's my little meditation outside of astrology, even though it's astrological, is trying to find that one or two words, that somehow encapsulate, the meaning for the day. Every day I take, and again, just try to make it into just a short little blip that, even though there's longer words, for today is pushing the limit. And then there's a quote every day from some person, but finding the person and the quote and then creating the graphic and the typographic and creating, to me, that's like one of my little daily meditations. I love doing that.
It's brilliant, and it shows. And the depth, the amount of quotes that you have, like the depth of your quote library.
Thank you, Internet.
Incredible.
The external mind.
You picked the right ones. And for any of you who missed Astrology Foundations Level 1 and Astrology Foundations Level 2, you can take those courses. So those are available. We're working on the next level of experience from that. From those two courses, which is going to be very different than the first two courses, but I think you're going to really like it. And that's in the works. But if you are interested in learning astrological foundations with Rick, you can still get those courses, astrologyhub.com/foundation, and check that out. More. Go ahead.
By the way, today's quote for today's planets, which has to do with Mercury and Mars and Pluto and kind of investigating and getting to the bottom of the stuff and not stopping because there's always more. Mm-hmm. I have a quote from Sojourner Truth, who, as many of you probably know, that she was a slave and the first one who was legally freed, I think, in New York State. And became an outspoken advocate for abolition and temperance and women's rights and civil rights. And she wrote, quote, I am for keeping things going while things are stirring. Because if we wait until it's still, it will take a great while to get it going again.
Wow.
And so this is pushing the limit. Right now, things are stirring. And just because they're not stirring maybe as crazy or as fast as they were 3 months ago or 2 years ago, things are still stirring. It's that alloy that has not settled yet. And if we wait until things become still, we're not going to have the same level of chance to infringe or to influence the future in the way that we still do right now. I am for keeping the thing going while things are still stirring, because if we wait until it's still, it will take a great while to get it going again. Sojourner Truth.
Brilliant. Perfect way to end. Rick, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community. Thanks for tuning into this episode. And thank you, as always, for making astrology a part of your life.
And thanks for the lilies and the irises.
You're welcome. Happy birthday, Rick. We're so happy that you were born and that you are in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.